Hello, and welcome to Denver Urbanism, a podcast on all things city building here in the beautiful, wonderful, and chilly city of Denver. Today, I am, of course, joined by Andy Cushen.
Hello.
But we are also joined by Ken Schroeppel.
Hello.
Ken, if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself to our listeners.
Sure. Hi. So my name is Ken Schroeppel. I am the director of the Master of Urban Design program at the College of Architecture and Planning at CU Denver. I'm also one of the professors in the Masters of Urban and Regional Planning program. So I've been teaching here at CU Denver in urban planning and urban design for 12 years. Prior to that, I worked for 12 years as a consultant in urban planning. So I've been doing this planning thing now for 24, 25 years. And I got into planning back in the 90s because I was serving actually on my neighborhood association board. RNOs they really deal a lot with planning related issues, parking, traffic, zoning, development, those types of things. And I was already planning curious, you might say, at that time. And then just having the experience of serving on my RNO board and all of the ways in which we were engaging with urban planning at that neighborhood level prompted me to get my master's degree in urban planning. And then here we are 25 years later and still doing it.
Also the founder of Denver Infill and Denver Urbanism.
Well, yes, that is true. So yes.
little street cred in that we're even calling this Denver Urbanism with your blessing. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. In 2004, Denver was starting to see a decent amount of infill development. It was early on in that era of infill development, and it got to the point where there were so many projects that were starting to be announced or getting under construction in the downtown area that one day I said to myself, there really ought to be one place where you can go and see what's going on, all of the different infill developments, because I was having a hard time keeping track of all of them myself. And I thought, a website would be a really good way to do that. Nobody really had anything quite like that. And then really on a whim, I said, I know, I'm just going to do it myself. And so I reserved the domain name Denver Infill, got some server space, got some cheap web software, and started to build out the original Denver Infill website. And then in 2010, I believe it was, I launched Denver Urbanism as a companion website to Denver Infill. Essentially, Urbanism covers everything that we don't cover on infill that's specifically just projects, infill developments. And then in 2011, Ryan Dravitz came on board. He's my blog partner. He first started off just taking photos for me on Denver Infill. And then quickly we became good friends, and he became more and more integral to the whole project and became my blog partner on both infill and urbanism after a little bit. And so he and I have been working on this now for over a decade together.
Awesome. And I think probably anyone who is listening to this is somebody who already uses Denver Infill and perhaps Denver Urbanism as well. So you're probably already familiar with Ken's work there. So we could probably have every single podcast with you, Ken. But you're a more important person and thus busier than Andy and I. And so we've got you for one topic today. And we wrestled about what we wanted to talk about, but we landed on historic preservation. Okay. Historic preservation is a mighty force in this city. Depending on who you ask, it can be for good or it can be for ill. And we wanted to just sit down and pick your brain about how that process works, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and put a little bit of a microscope on this.
Yeah.
Well, maybe let's start by just kind of asking the question broadly. Why would anybody be preoccupied with preserving old buildings, aside from the property owner itself who doesn't want their building to fall apart? What's the interest in preserving something that's old?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think historically we want to look back to the post-World War II era. This was an era when in cities throughout the United States, cities were generally falling into decline. This is a period of suburbanization, population declines, disinvestment in inner cities. And the federal government came up with this brilliant plan to revitalize cities called urban renewal. And they said, a lot of the core parts of cities consists of building stock that has largely been developed in the 1800s, maybe early 1900s. But at that point, it was a century old or so. And a lot of it was not in good shape. And the philosophy was, well, let's tear it all down and start with a clean slate. So that's what happened. And we saw vast swaths of our cities across the country, including Denver, lose substantial number of historic buildings. Buildings that were beautiful. Now, not all of them were in great shape. Some of them probably should have been torn down. But there were definitely a lot of buildings during that time that were torn down that if they were around today, we would be pointing to with pride as buildings that are beautiful landmarks in our city. Much the way that we might today point at, say, the Brown Palace Hotel or something like that as a substantial, beautiful historic building. So we were tearing down all these buildings throughout our cities, and that causes us to lose a part of our identity. We lose our history, our sense of place, particularly in fairly young cities like Denver, where some of those buildings that were torn down were, frankly, the original buildings or very close to being original buildings. So we lost just a lot of connection to our roots and to who we are as a community when we did that. There are all sorts of other things wrong with urban renewal. Aside from losing buildings, it also significantly displaced people of color, lower income people. It was very disruptive to communities, to families, and so forth. So there's a lot of things that, particularly now in hindsight, we look back at that era and say, what were we thinking? Right. Partly in response to the urban renewal era, the kind of the modern day historic preservation movement arose in response to that. And here in Denver, the iconic DNF Tower at the corner of 16th and Arapahoe was going to be demolished. In fact, it's the large DNF department store that was attached to the tower was demolished. It's not there today. It's essentially where the Tabor Center is today. But even the tower itself, the bell tower, was going to be demolished. And when Denverites heard about that, that was really kind of what put historic preservation over the top in this community to really galvanize the community to say, really, do we have to tear down all of these beautiful buildings, even the ones that are very iconic, like the DNF Tower? So the roots of historic preservation are really important. And just to illustrate what we lost, the stretch of downtown between the alley between Larimer and Market over to about Curtis Street, and then from Cherry Creek to 20th, it's 20-some city blocks. That was the Skyline urban renewal area. And it was essentially flattened with just a few exceptions of buildings saved. That was phase one of Skyline. That did happen. Phase two, which thank God never happened, but the plan was for phase two is going to pick up where phase one left off on that alley between Market and Larimer, and it was going to wipe everything out over to Winecoop Street.
Wow.
That's what we call lower downtown today. Now, can you imagine Denver without lower downtown?
Yeah, wow.
And what that would be in terms of a loss to this community's identity? Not to mention just like really cool buildings and places. So there's all sorts of really, really important reasons why historic preservation is a thing and why we have been preserving buildings. Again, particularly I think in a city like Denver where we don't have a history that stretches back centuries or millennia. So even a building that's only 100 years old makes that a pretty old building in context.
And then I think, you're already putting a pretty fine point on it here, but this is a fairly recent move within American cities to take a look at the built environment and note which are historic or aesthetically pleasing or important structures and say no, that shouldn't be demolished. Oftentimes a reactive process as well when we are going through and looking to demolish something. This is, at least the city often has a response there of saying, well, is this building historic, and doing a quick investigation into the possibility that a building is historic before demolition happens. We're looking at maybe 50 years, maybe just shy of 50 years of historic preservation in Denver in this sort of formal way that we have.
Right.
There is a process, there's a city staff that work on landmark designations, and in those 50 years, now 4% of Denver's building stock are either landmark structures or in historic districts. So there's also historic parkways in Denver. We have other ways of designating something historic, but at least when it comes to the building stock, which is really what we're talking about today, thinking about that, 1 in 25 buildings in Denver has been determined to be historic or is in a historic district and contributes in some way to a historic district. So that's a pretty quick turnaround, I would even say. I mean, 4% really blew me away the first time I heard that.
Yeah, there's, I think, over 50 landmark districts or historic districts in the city. And then, of course, there are a number of individual landmark buildings, both locally and then also that some of the buildings are on the National Register of Historic Places as well. So sort of double landmark status in some ways. Yeah, so I mean, I think when we look at then that 50-year history, historic preservation was in response to urban renewal, in response to the modernist movement that rejected things that are old and valued things that are new. But 50 years later, we now find ourselves in a situation where historic preservation can be seen as a barrier or as a way of stopping development. And so now its use is getting a little more complicated. Let me put it that way. I think some of the obvious historic buildings that we would, I think 100% of the population would agree should be saved or should be landmarked are probably landmarked by now, or at least quite a few of them. I mean, for example, we have the Lower Downtown Historic District, which is a whole district of Lower Downtown. We have the Downtown Denver Historic District, which is an interesting district. It's not actually a district with boundaries, but it consists of 43 individual buildings, even though they're not contiguous, but they're in the upper downtown part of downtown. And that would include things like the Denver Dry Building, the Denver Auditorium, the Brown Palace, and so forth. And those 43 buildings, you can actually see a gallery of those on Denver Urbanism on our website. So if you go to the top menu and click on Photo Galleries, there's only one gallery, but it is of the 43 buildings that are contributing to the downtown Denver Historic District. And I think if you look at those buildings, most people would agree, yeah, it's important to save those buildings, like the Paramount Theater, for example. And then throughout the city, again, there are, all sorts of districts and individual buildings. We're getting to a point, though, that I think where the really obvious candidates are probably already preserved. So we're now getting into this stage where it's getting a little bit more complicated. And again, we're now seeing historic preservation sometimes used perhaps as with an ulterior motive.
And I think it's been helpful just to kind of lay out some of the context here, because if you are a person who's lived in town for the last 5 years or so, and you've been watching historic preservation sort of fights play out, and they often do, because especially when it's a fight, it tends to be pretty dramatic. A building that people have strong feelings about because it's been around for a while, somebody who maybe wants to demolish it, and then you sort of have these very obvious change versus not change. But the buildings that are being targeted in the last 5 years or so, a lot of them are residences. A lot of them are, maybe more commercial buildings of within the last, 50 years, being built in the last 50 or 70 years. So the fights that you're seeing play out right now are not about, well, hold on, we have this whole era of downtown. We have this whole era of sort of suburban development necessarily. It's really about individual structures and how, again, as I said before, the process, the way you see historic preservation play out now in Denver, is it is a requirement that before you demolish a building, that you just quickly check that it is eligible to be demolished because it could not be potentially determined to be a landmark structure. And that's the case for every building in Denver, right. Whether it's your friend's house or it is a large bank, in Uptown or something like that, or a historic church.
It does strike me that some of those things are actually maybe how I would want them to work, though, right? That if there's low-hanging fruit, it's been taken care of, and then now we are arguing on the margins. Is this historic? Isn't it? Right? That's a much more interesting conversation than this is a clearly historic building, let's preserve it. Or, in the case of your friend's house getting demolished, the last thing that we want is for your friend to have lived in a very historic home that was maybe home to a former governor or some important figure or played a central role in a historic event, to demolish it only for somebody to dig up a book years later and say, oh no, we tore down this structure, not having realized. And so some of these things actually seem like good things to me. Obviously, it is ripe for abuse, and we can talk a lot about some of the more interesting examples of that. But isn't this sort of what we want to be arguing here on the margins about what's historic and what isn't?
I think so. It's an objective way of trying to tackle this issue. At least that initial survey is an objective process. Every building needs to be reviewed. Even if it's a strip mall built in 1993, well, most people probably would just immediately dismiss that as not something that is historic and should be preserved. But where would we draw the line between checking it versus not checking it? So therefore, the better process is just to check every building. And in many cases, it's probably quickly evident that it's not historic, and a demolition permit can be issued, and off we go. But as you said, James, there are now buildings that are on the margins, and it's good to ask those questions. And of course, the city has been doing for a number of years now a comprehensive survey of all buildings in the city, 200,000 plus buildings. It'll take them a while. I'm not sure how far along they are in that, but that is an ongoing process that the city is working on, establishing a database of all buildings with architectural and historic attributes. So I think that also is a good thing.
I wonder if we might take a look at Chapter 30 of the Denver Revised Municipal Code, because this is where we actually find the standards for historic preservation. And as you talk about qualitative measures, as we evaluate different buildings around the city, Chapter 30 relies a lot on qualitative measures. And I think with historic preservation, that's inevitable on some level. But Ken, if you want to just bring us through some of these, and we can chat about them. We don't have to chat about all of them, but just to examine how this actually works in the city and what's going on when a building is being preserved.
Good idea, James. All right. Chapter 30, Section 3 of the zoning code says criteria for designation of structures for district for preservation. All right. And it has 3 sections to it. Number 1, the structure or district maintains its integrity. So that's important. So if the building has been remodeled and it's lost a lot of its integrity of the historic components, then it's not really, doesn't qualify. It has to be more than 30 years old or is of exceptional importance. Now, the 30 years old, that is a very objective criteria. Right. It's either 30 years old or more or not. Exceptional importance, what does that mean?
Good question. Do we know of any examples that are exceptionally important, or is this sort of something that somebody put in just in case there was a building erected 10 years ago that rockets to the height of importance within that time period?
That's a good question. I don't know.
I don't know either. We can keep going, but to your point, it is very subjective.
Yeah, at least that second part of that second one is the exceptional importance. And then the third one, the structure or district meets at least 3 of the following 10 criteria. And here's where we have a significant section of very subjective criteria. So, for example, number 1, it has a direct association with a significant historic event or with the historical development of the city, state, or nation. Well, okay, significant historic event. What does that mean?
The Declaration of Independence was not signed in Denver, Colorado.
That's true.
I need a source on that.
Significant to whom?
Yeah.
Right? With the historical development of the city, state, or nation. Well, direct association with. Almost any building, I guess, to some degree is associated with the historical development of the city by its existence. So that first one, feels very, very vague, very open to interpretation. Number 2, it has direct and substantial association with a recognized person or group of persons who had influence on society. What is a recognized person? If a person was mentioned one time in a Denver Post article in 1897, does that make them recognized because they were in the paper once? I don't know. I mean, what does that mean?
And which people have influence on society is an ongoing question
Absolutely.
and always worthy of examination of, who has influence on society. So when you read it that way, you can also imagine that there were probably buildings that for a different community were very influential, recognized people in the community who, the folks who maybe made this determination didn't see that recognition.
Yeah, you could say recognition is in the hands of the people with power. So that's really one of the criteria that, as you point out, Andy, seems like an opportunity that historically could have and probably has been used to not include communities of color and others who don't necessarily have power and privilege in Denver.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Next one. It is a significant example of the work of a recognized architect or master builder.
This is the one I feel when I read, because I'm a very exciting person, when I read historic applications for landmark status, what I see this one contested all the time.
Yeah.
Because this is also a process here where the buildings that have been preserved continue to sort of live large in the imaginations of people who then are looking at other buildings and deciding, well, Burnham Hoyt is a fantastic architect. Sure, Burnham Hoyt, his work, on Lake Middle School or Red Rocks, for instance, that's a name. Those are two places you might recognize. But if Burnham Hoyt's work hadn't been preserved so far, would we then look at the one example of a house, small residential house that Hoyt did in a neighborhood he never normally worked in, and say that that is a significant example of the work of a recognized architect or master builder? Right. Or would we actually just be reifying what we've already decided was historic in other contexts? Mm-hmm. I see that one play out in that particular way.
Right. And again, here we have this word recognized. So what does that mean? Even back in the, let's say, 1920s, 1890s, there were quite a few architects in Denver. They ranged from a few that were probably pretty darn notable to quite a few who were designing simple homes, right, simple commercial buildings, and architects who had no notoriety or right, recognition really at all. They were just doing their job, making everyday buildings.
And I think also, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, well, they're being nitpicky about this or that, right? If there's a Frank Lloyd Wright building, then that's a recognized master builder or recognized architect. Yes, totally. That goes back to our point from earlier, where there's a cluster of buildings that are clearly due for historic preservation, and the rest needs to be fought at the margins. And I think the point here is just these margins are incredibly gray. A recognized architect, yeah, like you said, there's a newspaper article about this guy from 1920, and he was recognized because he built this building, and this building. But none of these buildings had cultural impact in a significant way. They didn't change the course of Denver history or anything like that. But that person was recognized, and so, as we fight these things at the margins, it's almost like we need more quantifiable or at least stricter language around the qualitative aspects to make these useful in some way.
You're right, and not only is it this question of, is a particular architect recognized to some level of being worthy or not, but then we also have where we see this coming up in some of these historic landmark applications where it's not the architect, but it's the firm. So the architect of record was not recognized, but he or she worked for a firm that has some recognition to it. So now we're sort of a step removed. So that makes it even more gray, a little bit more complicated. So architect Tom Smith, who nobody has ever heard of, but he worked for a fairly prominent local architecture firm who designed this building. Yeah. So does that meet this criteria? Number 4, I don't know.
Serving this purpose, which is itself transforming the city. I think that's something actually we do kind of miss oftentimes in historic preservation, is we're looking at residences and commercial structures a lot too, but the buildings where people do their work, or the buildings in which the building happened, those are also buildings that had an impact, but they're not charismatic in the same way. They don't really live large in this criteria.
Yeah, this 5th one is just, it covers a lot of territory.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, again, the point here is that these criteria are subjective right off the bat, but then they contain within them words like significant, recognized, substantial, and those words just defy definition in this way. It really makes it difficult.
We don't really get away from that with number 6 here.
Yeah, number 6, it represents an established and familiar feature of the neighborhood, community, or contemporary city due to its prominent location or physical characteristics. Well, everybody who lives in Denver lives in a Denver neighborhood.
Right.
And they become familiar with their neighborhood, and they become particularly familiar with the buildings along the paths that they typically travel. Yep. So I go from my house down this street, down that street, across this park, and over here to this place where I'm gonna, where I work. Okay, so that's my path to work, and people have those paths in their daily lives. And so over the months and the years, they always go past that red house on the corner or the blue office building, next to the park or whatever.
Right.
And that becomes familiar to them. Does that mean then that any individual citizen in Denver, of which there are 700,000, if any one person steps forward and says, well, for me, that building is a familiar feature of my neighborhood or community, therefore it should be preserved? It seems to me then that every single building in the city could meet this criteria because it's familiar to somebody. Now, I think most people would say, well, okay, it's not reasonable to consider every single building in the city to be worthy of preservation. Therefore, again, where do we draw this line? Because it's very subjective. The next one, it promotes understanding and appreciation of the urban environment by means of distinctive physical characteristics or rarity. Not even really sure where to start with that one. I mean, it's fairly abstract, right. And I think you could pick a building somewhere and find an argument, a way to be able to say, well, this building promotes understanding of something or other from, for this perspective.
I think the examples that you might find in Denver that do use that are, for instance, several of the first ditches and canals that you would see in Denver that then affect the sort of size of a lot that is stepped back from the street. Or if you go up Perry Street north of 38th Avenue, you find there's a present canal that kind of runs through all these people's front yards, and they have these little bridges that go over it. But so then rarity maybe is the word there. Again, city borders themselves are a little contested and arbitrary. So something that is rare on your neighborhood maybe is not so rare across the street where they didn't have the money to cover over the ditches 30 years after Denver did that to all the rest of them. So, in that regard too, I think you can see that when you're looking for something that's rare, that seems, I think, on its face like a pretty objective standard. Oh, but we don't have that many front yards in town that have a functional irrigation ditch running through them, with little bridges across them. But is that itself, a thing that's laudable that we need to sort of then preserve?
Right. Yeah, perhaps. And I agree, Andy. I think the last word of that particular criteria, rarity, at least that does give us something a little to hang on to from a objective perspective, because that implies a count of some type, right? There are only 12 of these. Right? There's only 47 of these things, whatever that might be. Now, again, it still doesn't actually define what does rare mean.
Yeah.
Is it less than 1%, 1/10 of 1%? So, how small of a count does something need to be considered rare? Right. But at least it kind of is getting into something a little more objective. The next one, we're almost done here. It represents an era of culture or heritage that allows an understanding of how the site was used by past generations. Well, what do you guys think?
All of these things that we're identifying here, if you are looking around your neighborhood, and you should, and consider which buildings tell you about the history of your neighborhood or which buildings inform the way you move through your neighborhood, that is a very, very helpful exercise. You should do that.
Yeah.
Does that mean, though, that, for instance, a long-time golf course should remain a long-time golf course because it was previously used by past generations as a golf course, or that the clubhouse at the golf course was used in such a way? It's helpful to recognize what was and to sort of see that in the built environment, but does that mean that we need to preserve those things?
And I think it's really important to understand how sites were used by past generations and understand cultural eras that have gone by and how they've shaped our present day, particularly when those cultures and heritages were intentionally stifled by the white landowning men of the day,
Right.
who are trying to stop people from engaging in their own culture. And so, I think it's really important to include something like this. But I also just wonder, is it the building that tells the story? Or are there other ways of preserving these things in significant ways for everybody to appreciate and for everybody to learn that don't involve the preservation of an otherwise nondescript building?
Yeah, I think this one it's a really good example of how important and well-meaning these criteria are. I mean, these criteria, just as we read them, sound exceptionally important to me, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they're worded in a way that you could say, well, yeah, I'm all in on that criteria. I mean, I think that is that sounds like a really good criteria to have, because these are things that are important for us to do as a community, right? Individually, they all sound good. And in order for a building, one of the factors that needs to be met for a building to be, or structure to be preserved, would be 3 of those 10 that we just reviewed, right? So again, individually, they all sound really good, but all 10 of them contain language that makes them very subjective. And therefore, you could probably grab almost any building in Denver and craft a narrative that it meets 3 of those 10. And that, I think, is the situation we find ourselves in today, where sometimes that happens.
And I'll say too that one of the other thing that I'm seeing in this conversation and in this criteria is that the examples that we're seeing are people having an experience with a building, perhaps in their neighborhood or on a commercial strip that they go down all the time. But there are other buildings that fairly often the city says, yeah, that might be historic. For instance, there's the corner of Bannock and 9th is a small building that has really kind of a cool decorative element above the entrance. It used to be a cigar company, but nobody wanted to step in and save that building because it's not in their neighborhood, or it's in a part of town that they don't know super well. And there's not a lot of people that used to live in that neighborhood and now are moving into that neighborhood. So you, I think, also have this situation here where a building that is genuinely a beautiful building or a good example of something, but is a little unloved because of where in town it is, those buildings also kind of miss out here. If people don't care, then it doesn't get saved. Versus if you do care, even if it's not a very big example, but it's something that you care a lot about, you can get 2 friends to get with you and say that a building should be saved.
So once it's finished, it's a 30-year-old structure, it's maintaining its integrity, and somebody has argued that it meets 3 of the 10 of these criteria. What happens next for a building to become historically preserved?
Well, so the application is where we kind of see these criteria fought out and the integrity and the age of the building listed. Those applications are available online. A city staff member then sort of takes that application. They see if it has merit. Then it goes through a series of boards. The planning board, the whole city's planning board is involved. There is a landmarks board as well that votes on it. They make recommendations, and then ultimately it's a land use decision with some tax benefits for you if your structure is named a landmark. So it goes to city council, and city council has a public hearing where they hear from residents and neighbors, about whether or not they actually think that it should be designated a landmark. And as you've pointed out before, only twice have city council named something a landmark that the property owner opposed.
Gotcha. Okay.
So maybe should we launch into a couple examples? So there is an example going on right now on Montview Boulevard, Montview and Elm. There's an old house, almost 100 years old, say it's like 90 years old. And at one point it was owned by the entrepreneur that at one point owned literally every single movie house in Denver. This is a wealthy guy. He was well connected. He was definitely in the Denver Post on several occasions and was recently bought by somebody. And when they bought the home on this big lot, part of town where they'd like to live, they found that There's rot in many places, that the home is not in good condition on the inside. But the criteria that the folks who then petitioned against the property owner's wishes, they identified the builder, the person, the prominent location, and a physical attribute of a neighborhood. I'm not saying that we should quibble on each and every one of, like, oh, well, that's not the right criteria for this or that. But when someone loves a building like that, even if it's not practical to try and restore a building like that, the point of these fights is that they are nitpicky. One more building, or it's one new building in a neighborhood. And that's where you get people, again, who get very aggressive about this or fight this.
Yeah. You mentioned something a minute ago that I wanted to follow up on because it really relates to this example that you've given, which is it's interesting the relationship between the sudden interest in preserving a building when somebody is proposing to tear it down. In other words, my point is if this building was so important, if it was a significant example of this important person, pick some language from one of these 10. If it was one of those things, then why haven't we been talking about that building for a long time? Why isn't it already a landmark? Why is it only when somebody is proposing to tear it down do we suddenly discover how important this building is? And of course, I'm saying that a little sarcastically, because we know that the sudden rush to declare a building a landmark is being done specifically to block its demolition, which is directly related to a development of some kind.
Right.
And I think that connection between those two events is something that has tarnished this landmarking process in Denver, because now you hear people talking all the time about how landmarking a building is essentially a tool that NIMBYs can use to stop development.
And a tool that we honestly might see more prominently. So let's say that, the Democrats in the state house decide, to do what a lot of other states have done and sort of take some of the land use control away from the city, as they, wanted to do last session. They might do this session, and say that in a place that's well served by transit, you can build 4 houses on one lot, where you could only build sort of 1 before, or 4 homes, on one lot in a new type of structure. This is exactly the downstream that you see in other places that have had these big fights for more housing in the past, is that then a community says, okay, well, we don't want that here. What will we do? We'll make this a landmark district or a historic district, or we'll decide that these places are historic structures. So if we don't have that scrutiny and awareness of how a tool like this can be used now, when citizens elect folks who then want to make change, does all it take to sort of stop that change is that's just 3 people that can submit a designation, over the wishes of the property owner? The answer is a little bit no, because it does then move. Landmark makes a decision and says, okay, well, we had an application and we think it's a landmark structure. The city council actually then has to approve that landmark designation as well. So there is another control here, but it's not a very popular thing to get to city council and for city council to then say, no, we don't think that that's historic. Sorry, neighbors. We think that they should demolish the building. Especially, again, because this fight is happening in response.
Yeah.
It's this, well, now that we're considering demolishing the building, now let's go dig in and find if it's historic. Versus you probably, optimally, you should just go around and find the buildings that are really genuinely significant, that do tell a strong story, that do inform folks.
And looking at some of the criteria, if we were to go around and look at the different buildings, I think we might end up with a different suite of protected buildings than we have in recent time. There was a fairly prominent story recently about a person who purchased a mansion that was built in the early 1900s and wanted to tear it down, but the neighbors said, no, we don't want that. And so actually, against the owner's wishes, for the second time in city history, city council said, this is historically preserved and you can't tear it down. And one of the things that they used as an evaluation criteria in that case was that the owner was a prominent person. And he was a guy who his dad had a grocery store. He expanded into a grocery store chain. And, that might be prominent, that might not. But I think that often the worry for me is that prominent person codes for wealth. and wealth codes for white guy back in the day. That, to me, does not indicate a prominent person. I think there were probably people back in the early 1900s who were significantly more important to their community than somebody who started a chain of grocery stores. So I'm also really worried about that too. Like, what are we missing because our criteria are set in a way that seems to favor power and wealth?
Right. That particular project that you were referring to, James, I believe is the one that was in City Park West.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The owner wanted to tear it down and build 37 apartments. And I agree. I think in that case, and we've seen this before from the staff reports from the Landmark Preservation Commission, where they identify a person associated with the house. It could be the builder or somebody who just lived in it. Let's say somebody who lived in it, like this grocery store owning person that you're referring to. And it seems to me that they inflate the importance of this person
Yeah.
for purposes of achieving the criteria. To me, it should be where you should be able to Google this person, and there ought to be like dozens of websites about this person,
Yeah.
right? I don't remember the name of the grocery store owner guy who was once the owner of the building in question. I'm guessing that if you Googled him, you might not find a lot. I don't know. That's just a speculation on my part. So I think that there is, I'll call it importance inflation going on here from city staff. But, let's frame this in another way. Historic preservation, or preserving buildings because of their importance, whether it's architectural or cultural or other ways, that ultimately is a value, right? It's a value that we have as a community, something that we say we believe in, we think it's important, it's a value of our community. But we have multiple values as a community, as a society. One of them that is, I think, shared by a lot of people in Denver is sustainability, environmental sustainability. So we know that low-density sprawl is a substantial contributor to climate change. Dispersed land uses, low-density housing, automobile-oriented development that requires everybody to have to drive around. It's expensive. It consumes a lot of land. And it's just, there's all sorts of social, economic, and environmental unsustainable things about sprawl. And I think most Denverites, most Coloradans would probably say, I'm anti-sprawl. The opposite of sprawl is infill development, something I know a little bit about. People who do research on the impact of the built environment on climate change have identified the number one most significant contributor to fighting climate change is infill development. For every housing unit that you can build in an established urban place where the people who would live there can walk or have some other type of sustainable transportation to local goods and services and to hopefully their job, and it consumes lower amounts of water and energy and things like that, that infill development is one of the most pro-climate change fighting things that we can do. Denver's borders are landlocked. We've been landlocked since the Poundstone Amendment in 1974, with the exception of the annexation for the airport. And Denver has grown by 200,000 people in the last couple of decades. And so, of course, as everyone knows, we've had a lot of infill development. We still have a lot of parking lots and lower density areas that can be infilled and densified. And when we use historic preservation or seeking landmark status for a building where something more higher use of the land, in the case of taking down a large mansion and replacing it with 37 apartments, when that happens, now we have a conflict of values, because we can say, well, historic preservation is a value, but also so is fighting climate change, so is environmental sustainability, and so is continuing to promote development within the city and county of Denver, where arguably we have the best infrastructure and uses in place to accommodate density. I mean, we are the largest city, we're the capital city, core city in the region. So Denver is where you would want higher density development to go. That's our legacy, and also we have the infrastructure in place to accommodate that. We need to improve that infrastructure. Everybody knows we need way better transit and more bike lanes and whatnot. But compared to some of our suburban neighbors, Denver is a place where we can accommodate significant growth in the most sustainable way. So that's also a value.
And even when a landmark itself is not the issue, there's all these spillover effects to the way that we do landmarking in historic districts right now in Denver. So if your home is not historically relevant to the historic district in which you live, it's not a contributing structure, in the words of the preservation folks, you can demolish it, you can build something new, but that demolition and that new construction of your non-contributing structure all are subjugated to design standards within the historic district. There is this extra level of scrutiny. Even though your building itself was never acknowledged as a historic structure in this historic district, you now have this whole separate process you have to jump through if you want to build a duplex where your sort of non-contributing single-family home was before. Or, as we often see, if you want to see these, they're on YouTube from the Landmark Preservation Committee. Folks, who are doing their research and going to the Landmark Preservation Committee and saying, we think that this ADU that we want to build on the back of the lot of this historic home fits very much into the context, and this absolute teeth pulling just to get an accessory unit built in the backyard of a building that no one is trying to demolish. And so even when folks then are trying to do the right thing or trying to sort of build more or build more densely, these landmark designations and these historic districts have then this sort of second order of suppressing, well, it's too difficult to build townhomes in this historic district. So if the value there is historic preservation and the value is telling the story of the city's development, history, and preserving something beautiful, we can do those things without having this second effect, which is to make it harder and harder to then build in an area that, let's face it, the historic parts of town are closer to the center of town. They're probably historically built more densely than the newer, more suburban parts of Denver. And so those parts tend to be historic. If you look at a map of what parts of Denver are currently landmark structures or in historic districts, it really does just sort of start in the center of the city and go outward, because that's where the oldest buildings are, the buildings that are over 30 years old and had a historic importance in the development of the city. And so those places, even if 4% doesn't seem like a very high number of structures in the city to be designated historic, those places themselves actually do have an outsized importance because they are right next to the Capitol or right next to Union Station. And so then how we then treat that second effect does have a really big difference on where we develop our buildings.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Andy. You're right. I mean, most of the historic districts are within the core part of the city, but that's also where we have our best infrastructure. That's also where we have in place the ability to accommodate growth through higher density development. And then those two things become incompatible.
That leads me to sort of a wrap-up question, which is, if I were to put you, Ken, just in charge of historic preservation, you're the historic preservation czar, I give you complete control. What do we do to balance the needs of infill, the needs of historic preservation and of cultures and of stories to be told in our city? What might we do to that list of 10 to make it a little bit more in line with all of our values?
Yeah. Being the historic preservation czar of the city terrifies me. that thought, because that'd be a tough job. First thought, and since you've just asked me the question, I've had no time to think about it. This is just going to be a reaction, but I think the creation of new historic districts, larger swaths of land covering multiple blocks, I would think that we are nearing the end of that. There are dozens of neighborhoods in Denver that have almost all their building stock pre-World War II, and they're beautiful buildings. Okay, if we were to declare whole neighborhoods, Congress Park, Cheeseman Park, Highlands, Sloan's Lake, whatever. I mean, just there's the list goes on. If we were to just say, well, these neighborhoods are comprised primarily of older buildings that are, often pretty attractive, and I'm sure if we looked hard enough, we could find all sorts of important people that lived in them, and going back to these criteria. But if we did that, then we were really removing from a significant portion of our city any opportunity for change and to accommodate growth and to allow more people to be able to call Denver a home in desirable neighborhoods.
Yeah.
And because we already have over 50 districts that are designated as historic districts, my thought is that we probably should not be adding any more, or at least not too many more. And what's interesting about this is that this 30 years old threshold, well, now you're talking about buildings built in the 1980s, right? If a neighborhood in southeast Denver that was built in the 70s or 80s, consisting of typical split level or ranch style suburban homes with the big garage in front and the driveway, I mean, should we be saying that neighborhood is a good example of the type of development from that era, and we should preserve it? So do we just preserve most of the city and lock in place all of these neighborhoods because they are simply what they are, representative of the era of development? I don't think so. So, I think looking at this district level, I'm skeptical that there's room for many more districts in the city. Now, when it comes to individual buildings, I'm sure that there are dozens, hundreds possibly, of buildings out there in the city that are not yet designated as landmarks that probably should be. Maybe the survey that has been going on, maybe that can be accelerated. Maybe if I were czar, I would seek more funding to accelerate that survey, try to get the rest of the city done, or at least certainly the parts of the city where the older buildings are located, starting there, and then start to kind of work through that and in some sort of objective way start to identify buildings that are good candidates and take a proactive approach to preserving the buildings that we really would want to keep because they do meet these criteria in perhaps a more obvious way.
Gotcha.
That could be one approach.
Yeah.
I would also probably take a look at tightening the criteria. Maybe you have to meet 5 of the 10. Perhaps there needs to be a higher threshold for a owner opposed or a hostile historic designation application, where just any 3 people who probably live down the street and don't want change, that's not enough to trigger that application. I'm sure city council might appreciate that. I don't envy them at all. Because the other thing here is we live in the West, where we all know that property rights is a strong ethic in the West.
Sure.
And in the West, we typically bristle at the idea of the government telling you what you can do with your property. Now, we do that all the time because we have things like zoning where we tell people what they can do with their property. But in the case of where an owner is opposed to the historic designation of their building over their wishes, and a couple of neighbors down the street say, oh, it's a pretty building, we don't want it to go away, or we don't want the apartments down the street because it'll add parking or whatever, right? There's always some excuse.
Right.
There should be I think there has to be a higher threshold there.
Can I make some suggestions, preservation czar, as well?
Thank you. Yes, please do.
I don't know. I've been thinking a lot about this because I was looking forward to it, and I'm glad we had this conversation. For instance, in downtown, we recognize historic preservation as a priority. If you are able to preserve a building, on your lot or sort of connected with your development, you get a bonus of that historic structure's square footage for the development you want to do on the lot next to it. Just do that citywide. I think oftentimes, too, when we see these fights about, well, it's one person's home and we don't want it demolished to be, replaced with a duplex or something like that. That's not a hugely common one. It's typically a higher, increase in density.
Yeah.
But why don't we just have the ability for every single home in the city to subdivide into several units contained within its existing walls? Some things like those, if what we're finding here is that we're setting up fights that are very acrimonious and putting our values in conflict. Let's find a way to get folks to do the right thing with carrots. If the right thing is preserving some beautiful Dutch revival house on Gaylord Street, just down the street from City Park, okay, great. Let's make the developer the good guy there and say that in exchange for landmarking his own building, he gets to build another 20,000 square feet on the structure that he wants to build. O czar of preservation. I might ask in your mercy that you consider, those kinds of approaches which are themselves beneficial to both values. And we're just not there right now. Again, because the response has been so reactive in Denver, is that we really only kind of consider this when demolition is proposed. But we should just be able to say, hey, this is a neighborhood that has incredible pre-World War II streetcar suburb bones. And if you want to preserve your structure, you get a huge bonus on another lot that, was identified in the survey as not being something that was done by a master architect. So there are other approaches there that we could take and that we probably should take in order to sort of stop the acrimonious personal fights.
Yeah. And, that idea, what you're just talking about there, Andy, is pretty much what you're describing as transferable development rights, which is a thing that exists. It's not used a lot in Denver, but it does exist. It is a thing you can do, which is where you can say, well, we've got a historic building, and if it were torn down, you could put a 20-story building on the site. But we don't want to tear it down. Therefore, we will transfer the right to put 20 stories worth of building somewhere else. And probably the best example of that is the historic church at 19th and California, with the 1999 Broadway building that wraps around it, right? So there's examples of that. Now, that's a good idea. Maybe you should be the czar, Andy. But yeah, those are, I think, the type of conversations that we should have. Because ultimately, I think to wrap this up, we all value historic buildings. I walk through lower downtown on my commute every day from where I live in Lower Highlands to CU Denver, where I teach and work. And I love Lodo. I love all parts of Denver that have historic buildings. And thinking about certain buildings not being here causes me great pain, just thinking about that. But we also are a growing city, and we have to find ways of achieving both of those values, or meeting those values, right, of historic preservation, preserving our legacy, preserving our culture, the generations that have come before us and the evolution of the city, but also being able to accommodate more people, new neighbors, new friends who want to live in Denver. We all, at one point, moved here as a new person, right? At least I
had
did.
the good fortune of being born
Or
to a
be the
person
good
who
fortune.
probably was not born here.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the only true native Denverites are the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute. So unless you come from one of those peoples, you're a person who moved to Denver, or your ancestor moved to Denver, and you enjoy living here, so why shouldn't somebody else? And we live in an era where we know that our best approach to fighting climate change and to creating a more sustainable and equitable city is infill development and density. There's 1,000 reasons why that is the best approach. And so sometimes we might have to tear down buildings. And the question is of course, which ones and who gets to say, whether we should tear it down or not. And that's, of course, why we're having this conversation. And this has been a fantastic conversation because it just speaks to the complexity of cities, to the myriad issues that we face in planning and design and public administration. I think we're all trying to do the right thing, right? We all want what's best for ourselves, but also for our community and our neighbors. But it's always not clear what the best path forward is. And so we have debates like this. And sometimes these debates play out in pretty raw, brutal ways in the press or just in public, where we have neighbors pitted against neighbors. And that's too bad when that happens. But underlying those sometimes nasty debates are really important questions that we all have to grapple with, and we have to work together to find reasonable solutions, because ultimately we should be able to maintain both of these values of preserving our past and our legacy and honoring the people and places before us, and also building a city that can be a sustainable place for everybody who wants to call Denver home.
Well, this has been great.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ken. I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. And I appreciate you for listening to this show. If you want to join the conversation, join the debate about zoning and historic preservation and all things city building, go to denverurbanism.com and you can see blog posts there where you can comment, you can join in that conversation. Perhaps you could even write a blog for us. But until next time, Ken, again, thanks so much for coming on. And Andy, thanks for helping me host.
Thanks.